Everyone, let's try that again. Welcome to Chapter 6, Public Opinion. So what is public opinion? A collection of views held by a population about varying subjects, candidates, events, legislation, etc. So let's start with the issue attention cycle and what it is and how it matters here. The issue attention cycle, think of a big circle. And at the very top of that circle, you have something called the pre-problem stage. Now, the pre-problem stage is the time before you know that you have a problem. It's the time before you know that anything's going on. And then you have a focusing event. A focusing event is any event big enough to draw a lot of eyeballs to an issue at one time. Anything from a mass shooting to COVID to an election, anything that brings a lot of eyeballs at once and garners a lot of public opinion. Once that event finishes, you move into the problem solving stage. And during the problem solving stage, you start to look for solutions. You start looking for ways in which to make the thing that's wrong either better or to fix it, or you're looking for a legislative solution or political solution. Whatever the situation is, you're looking for a solution to that problem. Then you move from the solution stage to the actual implementation stage. And during the implementation stage, back at the top of this chart, at the pre-problem area, another event is happening. So public opinion is taken away from the problem implementation stage of the first problem and brought back to the beginning of the chart to the focusing event stage. So public opinion can change on a dime away from this thing that was so terrible, so awful, so heinous that it should never be thought of again in society, and it should be fixed immediately to whatever this new problem is. Now, in the meantime, the cycle continues, and so we get to the evaluation stage. A little time goes by, and we get to the evaluation stage of the original problem. And when we get to the evaluation stage, people get to analyze it and say, did the solution work? Did the thing that we tried to fix it with fix the problem, or did it not? Et cetera, et cetera. And in the meantime, the cycle just continues and continues and continues and continues. And that begs the question, can you step in the same river twice? So I posed this to my in-person classes today, and there were a lot of mixed answers. One logical answer was, well, no, obviously, because the water keeps moving. Another gentleman said, well, yes, the silt on the bottom or the mud on the bottom is the same. The location is genetically or theoretically the same. And anywhere that you step inside of the Mississippi River, that's still the Mississippi River. So you can, in fact, step inside of the same river twice. I contend that in terms of the policy argument, which is what we're trying to frame here, even though the issue attention cycle continues to move and continues to move and continues to move, each time that we face a set of problems, we're going to address them in different ways. So no, in my opinion, you never actually step into the same problem or the same river twice, because you do either deal with or experience those things differently based on time, based on circumstances, based on candidates or events or whatever. You face those things at different periods in your life, and therefore you never actually deal with the same problem the same way at any given time. Political socialization. This is the process by which we acquire our political ideologies and opinions about how government should function. This is the process by which we literally figure out the way that we want our world to work for us. These opinions and ideologies become more rigid as we age, making it less likely your views will alter. There's the old adage of the younger you are, the more liberal you are, the older you are, the more conservative you are. I think that that line, there was a study that showed that line is actually changing, and that the older we're getting now, the more liberal we're getting. Now, what are the factors of such? Well, of course, family, for one. Any close relatives always can have a major effect on the way we see our society and the way that we're raised. Our schools, the people, especially with government, the people that teach us government, like me, the students that we talk to, that in the discussion boards, the way that we actually see government is shaped in a lot of ways by our schools and how we're taught. Our peers at work, just the people that are around us, our friends, the way and places that we worship, the neighborhoods we live in. We talked about ghettos and civil rights. Some people live in low income housing, some people live in mansions in suburbs or in suburbs close together. Some people live in rural areas spread apart. Some people live in cities stacked on top of one another. Everybody lives a little bit differently. Our work, the jobs that we decide to take on, be it a fry cook at McDonald's or a fast food restaurant or a greeter at Walmart or changing tires in a mechanic shop or building our own business. Whatever work we do is going to influence the way that we see our government and the world around us. Events, the things that we experience as individuals are going to change the way that we feel about government and the way that we feel about our society. And of course, media and the things that we consume, from music to news to movies to comic books to books themselves. All of those things can change the way that we socialize with each other and the way that we perceive our world. Now, of course, there are political ideologies that change the way that we think about our world. And fascism, at a most base level, is a society or the way of organizing society in which the government is ruled by a dictator figure at the top who controls the lives of the people and in which people are not allowed to disagree with the government or what the dictator says. And authoritarianism, it's a evaluation of order and control over personal freedom. So instead of actually having true liberty, we value order and control over uh, personal and individual liberty. In conservatism, there's an emphasis on tradition and a reliance on the individual to maintain society. The good guy with the gun mantra, that's generally where the individualism comes from. Now, of course, there are moderates in the center, those that draw from between the conservatism side and the liberalism side, between the far right, which is fascism, and the far left, which is communism to straight libertarian. These people exist in a world where both sides should have to be able to come together and find common solutions, be them crazy or not. Liberalism that emphasizes again individual autonomy, but also equality of opportunity. Different from conservatism, in that the traditionalist conservative thought is that you work hard, and when you work hard, you get rewarded for that working hard. For liberals, it's more of an act of everyone is equal in the eyes of government and the world, and therefore should be given as equal a footing as possible to pull themselves up, or not to pull themselves up, but to fail and to actually be able to restart if they have to with a safety net underneath them. That's liberalism. And it's whereas conservatism traditionally values like things like profits and especially businesses, liberalism despises those institutions and wants to see them brought down. Not brought down, but brought to heel, I suppose. Socialism, the political and economic theory of social organization, where the means of production, distribution, and exchanges should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole and distributed by the government as a whole to the community. Communism is the extreme form of socialism. The government controls all of that stuff. Individuals themselves do not own anything, whereas in socialism, you're allowed to own like individual parcels of land or things of that nature. In communism, the government owns all of it, and everything's equally distributed amongst the wealth that everyone helps create. And then, of course, there are libertarians. Libertarians want to do as much as they can do within the regular constraints of the world and do it pretty much in whatever way they want to do it, as long as they don't infringe upon anybody else. They want essentially no state control over what they're doing at all. The problem that generally I run into with libertarians is what happens when somebody does overtake your individual sphere. And most of the time, somebody will say, well, the community will take care of it. It's a community honor system, whereas on the whole, if somebody steps out of line, we take care of it. Well, that's not necessarily true, is it? Without state intervention, the punishment for going over the line could be massively more than what it probably should be. But again, that's just one. Scientific methods produce the most accurate polls. Now, polls themselves measure the public opinion on a specific choice or circumstance at a specific moment in time. These things are not flawless. Polls rely on a set of criteria in order to work as efficiently as they possibly can. That does not make them infallible. The 1936 Literary Digest poll, for example, predicted that Alf Landon would beat FDR soundly in the 1936 election. That people were tired of Republican or Democratic policies, tired of FDR social programs following the Great Depression, tired of the things that FDR was trying to do with the Supreme Court, and just generally tired of the Democratic Party. The 1936 Literary Digest poll predicted Alf Landon to win handedly over Roosevelt in that election. When the election actually happened, however, it was Roosevelt who won in an absolute landslide over Landon, winning every state except for the state of Maine on his way to sweeping the country. Now, why did the Literary Digest poll get it wrong? The simple reason is that they oversampled. They sampled over 10 million people, getting 2 million responses, which is honestly unheard of in today's society. But the problem was they were getting 2 million people to answer that were very, very wound up in the idea of supporting or not supporting Franklin Roosevelt. They were extremely motivated in that area and therefore more likely to respond to a poll where they get to talk shit about Roosevelt. On the other side of that coin, they also surveyed a bunch of people in 1936 who had the ability to subscribe to a magazine or to a news bulletin paper. Magazines don't technically exist, as I understand it, in 1936. This is like a pamphlet that comes in the mail, like almost like a newspaper, but a step up. And it is a magazine for all intents and purposes, but it's not what we understand as a magazine is today. It's just words, mainly, and cartoons. So this magazine coming to people's houses, that's a luxury. It's something that a lot of people don't have. And the surveyors are surveying people on car registries and telephone registries as well. This is how they're actually finding these people. And it creates a sample bias, and actually a non-response bias, where those that are more motivated to say negative things about Roosevelt are responding, and those that are less concerned with those things and more worried about the world around them, especially in the middle of the Great Frickin' Depression, don't answer at all, which leads to a massive bias and the Literary Digest poll being totally wrong about the election. And then the 1948 Gallup poll. Gallup did a poll on a throwaway race between Harry Truman, uh, George Dewey, Strom Thurmond, and there's another candidate that didn't even register in the polling. But there were a lot of things going against Truman during his election. There was a selection bias in the polling, first of all. Pollsters were allowed to pick based on a certain scientific criteria designed to fix the flaws in the 1936 poll, but the pollsters themselves were allowed to individually select those that were actually able to respond to the poll, which meant that they were creating a selection bias in terms of how they were selecting individuals, which led to a favoration of Thomas Dewey overwhelmingly over Truman, who was underwater in his poll numbers at the time. He was underwater in his favorability. He was just kind of low energy, not really doing bad at his job, but not really considered to be doing great either. Not exactly killing it at the White House. And then he also had a spin-off Democratic challenger of the Dixiecrats because of the civil rights platform for the Democratic Party in 1948. So Strom Thurmond ran against him, and Strom Thurmond's goal was to get the rest of the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, the South and many other states could potentially sway the outcome of the election just based on because when it goes to the House, each state gets one vote for president. And during that time, civil rights was not the golden pumpkin that everybody knows it as for the 1960s and 70s, for example, with Johnson and Kennedy, or Kennedy and Johnson, I should say, to put it in chronological order. But in 1948, this is still a relatively new thing. And if that race had gotten to the House of Representatives, there's a good chance that Truman doesn't become president again. And ultimately, it leads to one of the best political images of our time. And it's from the Chicago Tribune printing a headline of Dewey defeats Truman. They were so convinced that Thomas Dewey was going to win that race that they printed the next day's edition early. And when Harry Truman won the race the next night, he held up that photo for the crowd. And they went berserk because their man had won. And Truman had beaten the odds and won re-election to his presidency. Now, the methodology of polling itself. This is the scientific way that we conduct polling. First, you got to define the population. You got to know the audience that you're speaking to. You're not going to go into a room full of elderly people and ask them about technology, for example. You got to know who you're talking to. Now, amongst that population that you selected, you got to get a representative sample of the people that are inside of it, and you do that through random sampling. You're never going to be able, if you're doing like a national poll, you're never going to survey every single person in the United States. You're just not. But you're going to be able to sample these people. Say you send out 10,000 letters and you get a 2,000 letter response. That's a high positive response rate, or that's a good positive response rate, which leads to the sample size. And the larger your sample size, generally speaking, the more accurate the poll, although you can get too big, as we saw with the 1936 poll. But generally speaking, mathematically, the margin of error is the lower the margin of error, the more accurate the poll. So the lower, so if you got a plus or minus, generally the sweet spot is around plus or minus 3 or plus or minus 4 points. And those points can go either way, to the positive or to the negative. And that's your bias in your polling. So if I said that 38% of Americans support eating chicken, 37% do not, that leaves like 15% that don't care. With the plus or minus 3, it could be 51%, it could be 45% to the good or to the bad. And it could raise either the don't care or the don't like number, either way. But those points are spread in a manner that it shows you This is the scientific way that this poll could be accurate or inaccurate. And then the wording of the question of the poll can allow for bias. Uh, some bias uh, is leading questions, like some children get ill after getting vaccinated. Should vaccinations be allowed in public schools? You see how it leads with that. Some children get ill when they get their vaccines. Are you sure? Are you sure that we should make vaccinations part of our public school curriculum or public school requirements? Do you see how that leads you to a conclusion? Or there's another one. Where do you enjoy drinking beer? And this assumes that you enjoy alcohol or just beer at all. And that would lead to confirmation bias, or not confirmation bias, but it would lead to a bias in people just if they're asked something where they feel like they could be challenged in a way or embarrassed in a way if they act like they don't know the answer, then they could potentially change their answer to fit the question rather than just answering the question honestly. Now, most calling these days occurs over the phone or online. I actually got called yesterday to do a 3 hour survey on the 20th, which will be pay me $150. I signed up for this website. It's pretty cool. But a lot of the polling now happens over the phone or online through things like random digit dialing, where a computer legitimately just dials the phone until somebody answers. And then once they answer, they connect you to an agent who conducts the poll. And then there's computer assisted telephone interviewing, and then robopolls. The computer assisted telephone interviewing is very simple, very AI generated yes no questions, or push one or two or three, and they'll collect the results that way. The robopolls are exactly what they sound like. When you can put up a poll on Facebook on your story, that's what a robopoll is. It's the same concept. It's a technologically aided poll. Now there are several problems in polling. Timing, for example. Timing, if you're very fresh after a situation, you got hard opinions on what that situation is, or you're very biased to the positive or to the negative based on your proximity to the event, and especially the time that you spent reflecting on the event. Another way is that we talked about earlier is that as you get older, your views tend to harden, and you don't tend to change your views all that often. With timing and polling, the farther away you get from an event, generally the softer that you're going to feel toward that event. You've got to make sure as well that you are not framing or leading questions in a way that leads people to an answer versus letting them answer for themselves. And then, of course, the Bradley effect in 1982. Bradley was running for California governor as a black man against a white man, I believe, who was the attorney general. The attorney general polled very high in that election because people were calling on the phone. They were like, hey, would you vote for Bradley? And Bradley, of course, is a black man. And they would lie on the phone and say, well, of course not. I wouldn't vote for that guy. Absolutely not. I'm voting for the white guy. But then when they got into the voting booth and it was truly anonymous, they got in and voted their conscience or voted the better candidate. I don't know what the situation was, and voted for Bradley. And Bradley won that race, even though his opponent was heavily favored to beat him. So that's, we see problems in polling all the time. You look at 2016, for example, everybody, the thing is, everybody got it right in a way. We all knew the race was going to be close. We just all thought the race was going to be closer to Hillary Clinton's side than it wasn't, especially in the Northeast industrial corridor in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio. and Illinois. We really thought it was going to be closer in those areas, in that blue wall that separates the rest of the country, where if you can't win Florida and you can't win Texas, a Democrat path to victory runs through that Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan area, whereas Republicans generally they have to win Texas and Florida. They're generally going to lose the Pacific Midwest, or not the Pacific Midwest, the industrial Northeast, and lose California. And when you lose California, it makes winning Texas and Florida very important. Sweeping the South, very important. Sweeping the flyover states, very important, because you're going to lose New England generally. And that's how presidential elections are won, more or less. So we'll talk about that when we talk about voting. Push polls are modern attempts to influence voters. Push polls are generally a series of questions centering on a political or legislative campaign around multiple candidates, and the answers themselves are manipulated as respondents receive negative information for less than the desired responses in order to influence their next response. So you could say something like, Donald Trump, Nikki Haley, and Michael Pompeo are running for president. And you'll say, well, I want Nikki Haley to run for president. And they'll say, well, did you know that Donald Trump was the president and Nikki Haley has never been the president? And that Nikki Haley likes to eat worms? And that Mike Pompeo has dandruff? And that Donald Trump is perfect? So they give you these generalizations, these things that aren't necessarily facts, or they'll put a suggestion in your head that isn't necessarily true about the person that you're talking about, um, in order to sway your decision to your next response. That's how push polls push you in that way, which is what they're called, push polls, towards a certain candidate. And these last slide, experiences that affect public opinion, a lack of knowledge. Something can happen and the American people have no idea what it is, have no earthly idea what to do with it, but all of a sudden, we're experts. Take COVID, everybody's an epidemiologist. Take gun violence, everybody's a police officer that knows what they're going to do. Take police brutality, again, everybody's a black guy, and he should have just complied. We can all say that we know exactly what we were going to do, but the reality is we don't know anything until we're actually in those situations. And then opinions can change as we age, as we said before. We can go from being, the old adage is you're liberal when you're young, conservative when you're old. That seems to be changing, like I said earlier. But the old adage, for this purpose today, is going to ring true. Opinions about politics and policies changes with time and events. Again, the farther we get away from a certain issue or a certain political climate, the salter we tend to feel about the particular climate. Take, for example, the Clinton presidency. Clinton got a blowjob in the Oval Office and then lied about it. That's something that at the time was a major political scandal, was a major problem in politics. And now, with time and other events coming and going, Bill Clinton looks like he smells like a rose. The 2000 election, President Bush arguably stole that election with the help from the Supreme Court, who stopped the recounts in Florida from Al Gore. There's a real argument to be made there that President Bush never should have been president. But with time and other events happening, we don't know what would have happened if Al Gore had won the presidency, if 9/11 still takes place, or if it does, what would have been different with the war on terror. We just don't know. Opinions can form from two basic methods, heuristics and research. Now, heuristics, think mental shortcuts. Think those little prejudices that we put on groups all the time. Like if we see, for example, a person on the side of the road trying to hitchhike, we lock our doors. We see a homeless person begging for food, we just assume that he's going to go buy booze. We take these mental shortcuts to provide ourselves with less complicated things so we can get to the thing quicker so we can get on to the next thing. These things can form opinions about certain groups of people, like homeless people, and uh, major political parties, like liberals are out to kill the country, or conservatives are power hungry and unavailable for actual governing. All those things can be quickly formed in our mind, and then it's just there. And then there's research. Now, research means two different things called to me and to you. To me, research means qualitative research, quantitative research. It means getting out, doing the legwork. If it's a couple of years of work, we write a paper, we present it at a conference, nobody reads it. It's cited in some undergraduate paper 20 years later after the data sets have already been proved invalid or nullified. That's my idea of academic research. Your idea of academic research is probably picking up your phone, going to Google and finding the first top 3 articles that confirm what you want to see, and then that's it. The problem we have with research now is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is very simply the idea that we tend to drift toward the thing that we want it to be. We come out with a conclusion already in our mind, and then we go and look for things that confirm that conclusion instead of actually doing the work to understand how or why that thing is the way that it is. Another problem with research bias is that you have to be careful with the motivations of the researchers themselves. So if somebody presents a research paper and says, we did the legwork, like I was talking about, you also have to question their motivations for doing that research. Did they do it in a true scientific manner where it was double blinded and they had a hypothesis and they proved the hypothesis? Or did they manipulate the data to make the data show that their hypothesis was true when in reality maybe it wasn't? So you got to be careful about these biases inside of research as well. That's it for public opinion, and I'll see you in the next chapter.